สวัสดีค่ะ Hello everyone, welcome to Nudge Thailand interview series. Today is our third interview with a behavioral economist from Warwick University, Professor Andrew Oswald. Let me first introduce you guys a bit more about our guest today. Professor Andrew Oswald is a professor of economics and behavioral science at the University of Warwick in the UK. His work lies mainly at the border between economics and behavioral science and includes the empirical study of human happiness. He is an ISI highly cited researcher and is credited with helping to create the field now known as the economics of happiness, which is one of the fastest growing within social science. He has worked on 7 main areas, which are trade unions, labor contracts, the wage curve, entrepreneurship, home ownership, and unemployment, the consequences of high oil price, and of course, the economics of happiness and mental health. And today we will talk to him about well-being or happiness at the workplace and midlife crisis, which many of us have to deal with. And now Andrew is here with us. Hello, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here today with Nudge Thailand.
It's a great pleasure. Very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, so how are you doing over there? Are you still working from home?
Yes, I'm still working from home, and I think probably nearly all university researchers are. Obviously, it's a very strange time in this country and in many, many countries.
It is. So shall we start talking?
Yes.
Yes. So let me start with the first question. Just to get everyone on the same page, how do you define well-being at the workplace?
I suppose that the tradition is to let people describe their own happiness or job satisfaction in the way that they choose. Human beings are pretty good at judging, in my opinion, how they feel, whether they're in work or in their home and so on. We generally offer scales where people can answer numerically, say, or in terms of words, from I'm extremely satisfied with my job, for example, all the way down to the bottom of a scale, which might say, I really dislike my job a lot. I would say statistically, when one looks at the numbers, it doesn't make very much difference exactly how we do the scales.
I see. So there is not much difference, but so can we? My question is that how many numbers that we have on the scale when we measure there? Yeah.
Quite often in job satisfaction scales that might be given to people to answer, or happiness questions that might be given to survey respondents, there'll be something like 5 different categories. Occasionally it goes up to 10 categories, and sometimes on a formal mental health question, perhaps even up to 20 or 30 or 40. But if you have a large sample of people and you're looking for patterns, say, about how people feel about their wage or their marriage and their health and so on, I don't think it matters too much exactly how you ask the questions or exactly how long those scales are. If you've got lots of people, yeah, you can see the underlying patterns.
Yeah, that's cool. So the next question is that, in my opinion, I think it would be nice to be happy at the workplace, but some people might think that we just go to work and we just get our work done. So why should we pay more attention to well-being or happiness at the workplace?
I think happiness at the workplace is interesting for 2 reasons. First of all, I suppose we want a happy society, don't we? So all government policymakers and us as individuals presumably care about how much we enjoy work and what goes on in the workplace. This is a big part of life. And companies should care, organizations should care about whether their employees are happy or not, both because unhappy people will leave, and quits are expensive, very often to fill. It takes time and money for organizations if they have a so-called turnover problem with people wanting to leave all the time. And also we have quite good evidence that happier people tend to be more productive.
Oh, and this is going to be our next question. So why are happier people more productive in general?
I would say we don't really know scientifically why happiness makes people more productive. Perhaps one might have intuitions about that, but I find it quite intriguing as a scientific mechanism. We know from randomized trials that have been done, for example, at Warwick University, that there does seem to be a genuine cause and effect relationship, and there's interesting work following corporations through time, and happier companies seem to have better productivity later on, and so on. My own view is that happy people don't get distracted all the time by stressful, unpleasant thoughts. And I suspect this goes on instantaneously within us all the time. If we have a problem that we're worrying about or something weighing on us, then we're momentarily distracted, possibly all through the day, sometimes through the night. And it's that distraction effort that reduces our productivity.
That is interesting. So from your research, did you see the variability of well-being in different demographics? For example, age, firm size, positions. So in other words, what are the drives of well-being?
There's a long-standing literature on what seem to be predictors of well-being. Women report slightly higher happiness levels. Typically, richer people report higher happiness levels. Of course, those in good health. Many influences shape your mental well-being as a human, and some of those are quite predictable without looking at our equations. There's been a particular literature that my colleagues and I have worked on that studies what happens as you get older. And there is evidence for a so-called midlife crisis, or certainly a midlife low period. I'm embarrassed to tell you it's a long, long time ago in my own life, but at the moment I'm very happily accelerating up to even greater happiness. In short, we think that, at least for a great many people, happiness is roughly U-shaped through the life cycle.
My question is that another question is that if people with the same age but they are in the different position, for example, we have been, me and my friends work at the same company, but the position is not the same. For example, my friend he or she promote very early in the career. So is that impact in the literature, is that impact people happiness?
Certainly job promotion seems to influence job satisfaction. In other words, if I get promoted up to be a more and more senior professor, I tend to get happier. And that seems to be true, of course, in almost all organizations. However, there is a darker side to that extra happiness, and that is that we know stress levels rise. So it's not quite such a clear picture, you might say. There's a plus. I enjoy being promoted, but it does seem to carry a greater mental strain also. So there's sort of balancing act to be done. If you're the kind of person who wants to be promoted, then you can probably cope with the extra job strain. But it's not all good being promoted. It does have a darker side, and presumably that's why people get paid more as they move up organizations.
Interesting. So the next question should be is that how to improve well-being? In your opinion, who is responsible for well-being at the workplace of employees? Is it government, organization, boss, or employees themselves? Because here's when we hold the event and talk about happiness at the workplace, we always talk about how to make ourselves be more happy at the workplace. Yeah, but in fact, I think it should be more than that.
I'm not sure if governments have a lot of responsibility in shaping and improving the happiness of people at work, I mean, certainly government policy should set a kind of backdrop of safety and regulation. I would favour that. But the details of job satisfaction, how workers feel about their jobs, what organisations do for workers, I think those details are not especially the concern of government unless any laws are being broken. Presumably it's primarily in the interests of the employers. If I'm running a company, I don't want my workers leaving all the time, and I don't want my workers being so resentful that they don't want to do good work for me. So particularly firms might well want to know how to make their employees happier. And some organizations ring me up and ask me what I'd recommend for their company and so on. Individuals, I suppose, in their own lives also have to take some responsibility if they care about their own happiness. And we know quite a bit about that. We know that a sensible diet, choosing healthy food, a wide range of fruit and vegetables, that seems to be good for the brain and for people's positive mood. Exercise is good, and so on. But I think of job satisfaction as essentially something that organizations ought to care about.
Yeah, and you just told us that some organizations ask you to recommend how to make their people happier. Can you please share with us, like, what are your recommendations?
The nature of the organization would partly influence what I might recommend, but a broad thing to say is that what workers seem to like is autonomy. They like independence. They don't like a boss leaning over their shoulder too much all the time. For example, in early work with my colleague David Blanchflower, many years ago, we discovered in an international survey that if people said they could move their desk a little bit in the office, just a little bit, if they wanted to, while at work, those people were much happier. And I always recommend to employers, give your people small freedoms. Small freedoms, that's something that human beings really like, and they don't tend to be very expensive for organizations. So allow your workers a bit of autonomy. That would be a key bit of advice. Something else we know, and it's common sense, even though it took statisticians like me a long time to think it through, is that the nature of the boss really matters. Whether your boss can do your job is a good indicator of job satisfaction. So I will tend to be happier as an employee if I say in the survey, if necessary, my own boss has the skill to do my job. And that seems very interesting to me.
Oh, I see. Give your employees a bit of freedom, not the big, a small freedom. For example, allow them to choose where to sit or should move their desk here and there, or give them an autonomous. Or another thing is that the nature of boss who can work if you are not there. Right?
Well, the nature of the boss is important. Think about who you're putting in charge of workers. And when it comes to autonomy and freedom, of course, it's not necessarily about literally being able to move my desk by half a meter, but that's a marker of, it's a kind of indicator of the fairly small things that really make a big difference to employees.
Very interesting. So the next question is that being too happy can have an intended consequence or not. So here's the question. Is there an unintended consequence from being too happy at the workplace? For example, we have nice office, good pay, free meal. Does a little bit of stress make people perform better or not?
I'm doubtful that too much happiness among employees is a bad thing. I doubt that. On the other hand, of course, I'm a professor of economics and behavioral science, and I don't want my students to be too relaxed. I want them working. So I would like them cheerful, but keeping their mind on the job, keeping their mind on the fact they have to pass their exams and produce a dissertation. But I would always recommend that an organization would want its employees to be as happy as possible.
Okay. So, okay, the next question is about midlife crisis. So you have already mentioned a bit about midlife crisis, that we have a midlife low, and that's a U curve. So can you tell us a bit more about the midlife crisis? Is it normal, or does it just happen to some of us?
A midlife psychological low is quite normal. That's really typical. Presumably it doesn't affect everybody, because in the kind of statistical work that we do, we're looking at averages in the population. But it's certainly very normal around the age of 45 or 50 to feel like life is not as happy and not as good as you were hoping. I hope anyone feeling low in their mid to late 40s understands that they are not exceptional. That's quite okay, and nothing too much to worry about. The problem with this evidence for the midlife low is that, unfortunately, in some people there is a crisis. For example, we know in my country and in the United States, the suicide rate is highest in midlife, about age 47 in the UK, and something quite similar in the United States at the moment, and many other really extreme measures like clinical depression and so on. And that really is a concern. In other words, some people going through the midlife low, which is natural, experience it in a worryingly extreme way. I think there should be more public policy focused on that.
So do you know what is the reason why we all have this kind of crisis that we call midlife crisis? Like, what is the reason?
I don't know why there is a midlife low in human beings. I view it as a really profound scientific question. Obviously, there are certain things that happen to people in midlife that might be good or bad, but in a lot of this statistical work, we control out for that. So we're trying to get at the underlying forces beyond divorce, job promotions producing stress, children leaving home for university, and whatever. I think that the midlife low goes beyond all that and is somehow very deep inside, something innate in humans. Now, what drives that? My hunch would be that one day we'll discover there's a sort of physiological or hormonal explanation. I can't be at all sure about that, but that would be my hunch. And that's because one paper has been published suggesting that great apes, chimpanzees, also may have a midlife low. And I have a hand in that paper with some primatologists and psychologists. It's the only study of its kind, but if it is replicated in other kinds of animals, then it might suggest that there's something scientifically very deep going on inside us, and that's also true of humans. We just don't know at the moment, I'm afraid, but it's certainly one of the most striking patterns across many, many countries that I've ever seen in my professional career.
So how should we deal with the midlife crisis? Should we intervene or just let our ability to adapt work on it? Because as you just told us that you can see from the suicidal rate, so that there should be something, right? Or should be some policy to help people or not. Yeah.
Sometimes when I give public lectures about happiness in the midlife crisis, people come up to me afterwards and say, "Professor Oswald, tell me how to avoid it." And I always think, well, I've just shown you this long lecture on how you can't avoid it.
You can't avoid it.
It's a natural human tendency, in my opinion. So we have to face that. It's like saying, "I don't want my hair to turn grey, Professor. Tell me what to do." However, there are, of course, things that you can do to alter your happiness in other ways. So you might try to offset the low happiness that will typically come a bit in midlife with greater happiness from something else. And we really do know that certain kinds of diets, exercise, various kinds of activities can raise your happiness. So you might want to put more attention into those in midlife to try and offset what seems like a natural tendency. But the underlying force, I don't know how to stop.
I see. That's just so that's a we have already talked about happiness at the workplace and how to be happier and then we have already talked about midlife crisis that you can prepare for it, but probably you cannot avoid it. Okay. And next question is about COVID-19, because we are now in the, just like you said, in the strange situation. So what are the impacts of work from home on people's well-being during COVID-19 lockdown?
It's
I
a
think
really
you have,
interesting,
yeah.
it's a really interesting question to ask, how people are being affected psychologically by working at home much more because of the coronavirus pandemic. I think the truth is that scientifically we're not sure yet. We don't know how overall people are affected by having to stay home. I have for months and months and months. We aren't sure about that. I mean, there's definitely one positive feature though, and that is that by definition, it greatly cuts down on commuting times, commuting to work times. And there's quite a big well-being literature on the bad effects that commuting to work has on people. We also know from other sources, it's one of the periods of the day that seem to be least enjoyable. So there's lots of evidence that commuting is not really good for human beings. So that's a bonus from working from home. But offsetting that, almost certainly, you don't see nearly as many people, and most human beings want some work colleagues, and they like the friendliness of an office. I think it remains to be seen. We're going to need much more research on this over the next couple of years, but those are two of the forces that are probably at play.
I see. So, okay, people love meeting people, like, because we are social animal, but we also don't like commuting. But now that we have to stay at home almost like every day and not seeing other, so we are not sure yet about the result of it, and so let's see. So can you share with us a bit more about your research on COVID-19?
On COVID-19, I've been interested somewhat in the mental well-being effects, but actually more about what's the right policy response. And from March, which is when England went into a so-called national lockdown, I've been arguing that it might be sensible to try to let young people work as long as they stay away from the old, because we know it's the old as an approximation who are vulnerable. And for example, in my country, when you get to the age of 65, you get a pension and you don't actually have to go to work. And we know that those older than age 65 are the ones who are really at risk from the virus. We know too that young people are being particularly badly affected by the mental health consequences. So I would like to see more attention given to protecting the vulnerable.
I see. Here's one more question. I think it's a question from our team, and it's about suicide paradox. What might be the reason that the area that people are happier on average has more suicide rate? For example, people in Scandinavia.
Yes, it's a fascinating and very important but rather sad topic, thinking about what causes suicides, what causes people to take their own lives. And some work that a number of us have been involved in suggests that how happy people look around you seems to have effects. In other words, if I'm in a very low mood, if I'm feeling depressed, and people around me look like they're also having difficult lives, somehow it's easier for me to bear. But if I look around and I'm feeling like my life is really bad, and everyone else seems to be very, very happy, then that's dangerous for me psychologically, because I do comparisons. And there's a long history showing, in fact, even going back to Emil Durkheim, that in times of war, which is obviously a very bad time for a country, the suicide rate actually drops. And after 9/11 in New York City, although lots of people probably don't know this, the suicide rate actually dropped quite markedly after 9/11. In other words, I think that observing difficulties in others' lives puts our own difficulties into perspective.
Oh, interesting. So it's not that easy to be sad among happy people because we compare, like we do compare ourselves with Arthur.
It's harder on people to feel sad among happy people because
right.
it makes them feel relatively even worse. It's easier for you to
see.
bear your own problems if you see that others have problems.
I see. So I think we have done for today. Thank you so much for today. We have learned a lot from your experience. Let's see who is going to be our next guest of Nudge Thailand interview series. Thank you so much, Professor Andrew Oswald.
A great pleasure.
Thank you and goodbye for now. สวัสดีค่ะ
Bye-bye.